Okay, we're going to start now, and we have a very distinguished panel. Three members of the panel are joining remotely, and I'm grateful to them because the time difference, especially for Professor Shen Dingli, is quite punishing. So thank you for joining at this late hour in Shanghai, where he is at the moment. To set the stage, I'm going to ask my colleague at the Southman Institute for War and Peace Studies, Stuart Gottlieb, to really give us, maybe speaking a bit longer than the other panelists, at least at first, to give us really the context of what's happening. Stuart Gottlieb, is a young professor at SIPA, but he's also worked in the Senate with various senators from the Democratic Party. But he understands both sides of the aisle. You have also worked for a Republican, so he's one of those people in America who still understand both sides of the aisle, and that's why we thought he would be very good at giving us the context, where America is, where it comes from, where it's going. So, Stuart, over to you.
Thank you, Jean-Marie. I appreciate that. I also teach the main U.S. foreign policy course here at SIPA since 2003, which has been a while. I want to thank everyone for being here. Jean-Marie, Kent program, terrific institution. I want to thank Dove, everyone attending. I think it's a great, excellent program for the week, and it's a pleasure meeting all of you. I'm going to briefly set up the opening panel to the program by addressing the big orange elephant in the room, and that's Donald Trump currently upending decades of American foreign policy and longtime assumptions about the U.S. role in the world. And a world writ large and well represented in this program and in this room, scrambling to make sense of and respond to a world without stable U.S. leadership. I have limited time, as we know. I think the most interesting thing for me to do is pivot off the conventional wisdom that Trump's current wrecking ball policies, whether on global trade or global alliances or multilateralism generally, are unprecedented, counterproductive, and guaranteed to leave the United States and the world worse off. Whether or not this Trumpian period of American politics ultimately leaves the U.S. and the world worse off is, I believe, an open question and would require a lot more time to unpack and assess. We can have discussion time. But one thing I can offer up front is that none of Trump's controversial policy ideas are new or unprecedented. Trump's wrecking ball style, throwing a hand grenade in the room and seeing what's standing after, is unprecedented. But the political culture of the United States from its founding and over the centuries was never inherently oriented toward globalism, multilateralism, permanent alliances, unfettered free trade. In fact, quite the opposite. And what I just described are the foundations of what Westerners like to call the US-led rules-based international order that's been around since World War II. But in order to understand what the US is doing now, seemingly upending all of these rules that it created, it's critical to understand a little bit of the historical context. Time is short, so I only have time for two of the most prominent areas, global trade and global alliances. On global trade, the most consistent critique is that Trump's protectionist policies and tariff threats is that the U.S. is the greatest beneficiary of this post-World War II global trading system, so undermining or destroying it is irrational. And there's plenty of truth to that, in my opinion, as a free trader, but it's also true that the greatest period of economic growth in U.S. history came in the second half of the 19th century, when the U.S. relied on a mixture of free trade and often aggressively progressive tariffs. Between 1865 and 1900, the United States economy doubled 5 times, maybe the greatest production of wealth ever in history. The U.S. passed Great Britain as the top GDP in the world in 1870 and as the top global trader in 1920. A big part of this success was operating in the British-led open trading system, which the U.S. free rode on for the most part. And then the call began for the U.S. to replace Britain around the turn of the 20th century, but it took until 1944 for the United States, being the dominant economic power, still took 75 years from when it passed Britain in 1870 to take the lead on global trade with the Bretton Woods system and the GATT that came shortly after Bretton Woods. But there were huge critics of the United States even doing this, and Henry Cabot Lodge, this great protectionist in the end of the 19th century, warned the United States to never go into a leadership of free trade unless it's in America's interests and the voters recognize those interests. And the words of Henry Cabot Lodge still ring loud and resonate today, not just with economic nationalists like Donald Trump, but many others who believe the US-led free trade system has long been gamed by rising challengers, most notably by China. And not unique to the Trump era, in the 1970s, when the US felt that the Bretton Woods currency system was being manipulated by France and some other foreign investors, the US ditched the gold standard that was the back of the dollar and the back of the Bretton Woods system and began floating its currency. In 1971, Richard Nixon's Treasury Secretary John Connally explained why the US ditched the gold standard, quote, "I want to screw the foreigners before they screw us," unquote, which sounds pretty familiar. On multilateralism and alliances, that's even easier because the US being part of alliances and multilateralism is not the norm, it's the exception. The United States was born and grew to superpower status, actively shunning multilateralism and military alliances. This came from George Washington in his farewell address. This came from Thomas Jefferson, made it bipartisan in 1801 when he said it's the US policy for peace, commerce, and friendship with all, entangling alliances with none. And the US had 150 years following that doctrine all the way up into World War II. In World War I, the US entered the war and joined the Allies, Britain and France, but the US refused to join as an allied power. It insisted on joining as what it called an associated power. Even in the Cold War, the US created alliances. It created the North Atlantic Alliance. But what's that called? It's called NATO, not the North Atlantic Alliance. It's called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization because if it was called the Alliance, the Senate would not have ratified that treaty. That's how averse to alliances the United States has been in its history. Bottom line is, whether on economic engagement, multilateralism, or military alliances, American political culture has never lost its skepticism of the world, and that's why isolationist and unilateralist sentiments always resonate highly. But let me wrap up my time by bringing us to the present day, because I believe that the characterization that the Trump administration has upended decades of American global policy is technically true, but lacking important context. Trumpism is in fact a direct descendant of a fairly recent period, the post-Cold War 1990s, which witnessed the rise of isolationist, nationalist, and populist movements directly contra the expansive leadership role the US played during the Cold War, movements that were opposed to neoliberal Washington consensus. They were opposed to Fukuyama's end of history concept. There were loud bipartisan movements. Republicans had Pat Buchanan. Independents had Ross Perot, who ended up winning nearly 20% of the popular vote in the 1992 election. Bill Clinton was elected only with 43%. Ralph Nader on the Democratic side challenged Clinton in 96 and Gore in 2000, might have cost Gore the election in 2000. All three had in common anti-free trade, anti-US over-involvement, insisting allies pay for their own defense. Now, these movements were derailed for a time by the 9/11 attacks and America's highly globalized, highly militarized response, but they came roaring back in the 2010s following the 2008 global financial crisis, and not just in the US, but in several other leading Western democracies, including the UK, France, Germany, and even more so now in the 2010s. In other words, Trumpism is as much a symptom as a cause of anti-neoliberal, anti-globalist sentiment that has been building for 3 decades now. In fact, every post-1990s president, including George W. Bush, Barack Obama, made hay about radically reforming or even exiting the World Trade Organization and reducing and limiting America's role in the world to focusing on nation building here at home. Trump is simply putting into action what other presidents wouldn't, and he's doing so with a clear mandate from the American people. So these are policies we need to take very seriously. Allow me to conclude by categorizing Trump's foreign policy, which is something notoriously difficult to do for the purposes of discussing the present and predicting the future that we'll have some discussion on. We can safely say that Trump's approach to foreign policy is within the parameters of modern Republican foreign policy mindset, with its consistent assertions of American global primacy, and proud adherence to American unilateralism. Though some still call Trump an isolationist, he's much more a classic realist internationalist in his belief that the US should be making the rules based on its own national interest and its own so-called exceptionalism rather than abiding by them. Where he splits noticeably from traditional Republicans, from Ronald Reagan to both Bushes to Mitch McConnell and John McCain, is in his aversion to the promotion of US and Western values, which was seen in Trump's recent visit to the Middle East, during which I should mention his concept of no lecturing was welcomed by a lot of the participants of those meetings, which should tell us something. And where Trump also splits noticeably from recent Republican foreign policy is that his realist internationalism, which he calls putting America first, is applied consistently against foe and friend alike. It's purely transactional. It's non-ideological. I just have a minute or two left. But because no country can operate completely independently in world affairs, let alone a global juggernaut like the United States, this has led to glaring contradictions in Trump's policymaking, like declaring economic warfare against the very same friends and allies that the US needs for mutual security. During the discussion, I can get into more of this and more of Trump's other policies like Panama and Greenland, and I could show that those are also not unprecedented, believe it or not. But let me conclude by saying that while I don't agree with Trump's wrecking ball approach to reforming America's role in the world, I do believe much of the so-called rules-based order is in dire need of reform, especially the global trading system under the WTO and also alliance systems around the world that need to be more shared commitments. But reforms are also needed to address the other big elephant in the room this morning, and that's the strong discontent toward the Western-led order, not just by China, but across the so-called global South, where the vast majority of the world's population resides, and who for decades have felt left behind by a neoliberal order built by the West and that benefits the West the most. So hopefully with all of this wreckage, this marks a starting point for much needed reforms, making a fairer global trade system, more up-to-date and equitable alliance systems, and a greater sharing of global prosperity with less developed parts of the world, including reforming global development and humanitarian assistance. The good news is Trump will not always be leading these efforts. Let me break some news for you tonight. There will be more elections in this country, and others will come into office and they'll build on this. They might reform some of this. They might backtrack on some of this stuff. But the United States adapting, reforming, and adjusting is something that it has always done well throughout its history. And I wouldn't be surprised if something better does come out of these fights that we're having right now over how to reshape what's often called the post-World War II order, going on 80 years after that order began. So let me turn it back over to Jean-Marie. I thank you for the time.
Well, thank you, Stuart, for giving us some hope and for giving us also a background that goes beyond the immediate sound and fury of the last few months. I think that's what we need, because in this seminar, we want to look at the strategic issues, at the long-term issues, rather than at sort of the short-term shock. And well, I'm tempted to turn first to Professor Shen Dingli, from Fudan University in Shanghai, who's been the director of the Center for American Studies, who has looked at American-Chinese relations over a longer frame of time. And so, Professor Shen Dingli, can you give us your take, and then I will ask Arancha González to follow from the European standpoint. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Marie, for giving me the opportunity. Let me first understand how many minutes I can use, 5 or 10?
Let's see. I mean, in between 5 and 10.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, let me make 3 points. First, we do see a new America, which dramatically different from the America I first came to the US in 1989, when I did my postdoc at Princeton for 2 years. At that time, America is a country stressing liberalism, internationalism, international rule of law, which make me to feel so fascinated. America has great attraction in my country because at that time, America still has Voice of America. So young students like me, we often learn from Voice of America for our American English. Now, VOA is closed. Global Media Bureau is closed. And I used to work for Fudan University. Now I just retired. Before retirement, for a long time, I devoted my career as a director of Center for American Studies, China's top-notch think tank on China-US relations and American Watcher. And our center was given as a gift by the US AID, Agency of International Development. And we are given a gift. So all of us are blessed by American government people. Now the center is still there, but the AID is almost closed. So I feel a great loss. Why US want to cut its soft power, no longer help those who need this assistance to better understand America. To better understand America is not to beat America, but to make more cooperation with America. So America does not need to beat us. We can cooperate. So this is a new US, which in 3 areas fundamentally different from the old America. One, US no longer care global security. US only care its national security to block those illegal immigrants from the South, which I think are legitimate. US need to deserve its national border, but why not to give sympathy and aid to Ukraine? That poor country deserve all of our support from China, from India, from America, and I think Biden has not done best. America has not sent a ground force, but at least America gives spiritual support, give economic aid, and lots of military resource to make this small country, which has abandoned nuclear weapon, to be able to resist this aggression for more than 1,000 days. And this new America try to stay away from this, which make it less great rather than great again. Second, America is a great promoter of free trade. America has been using the national tariff about 2 to 3% for a long time, which benefit China and many other countries. And it's our time, after we become more mature in our market economy, we should open our market, much reduce our tariff to welcome American goods to export to China. America does deserve to have complained why China has not opened up more industry. But why America would beat China just raise the tariff unreasonably as 145%. That cannot course China would possibly make China to beat America with 125%, which would virtually make the two countries no longer be economically linked. So we have to reduce the tariff to current at this time, added tariff at 10%. Of course, aggregated total tariff is about 50% to 20 versus 20%. Why the two countries need to fight this way? Why America cannot complain, but to cooperate, to negotiate, like Trump, our first trade war with China, negotiate. And third, not to give Harvard University any right to recruit international students simply because Harvard does not subscribe to abandon its DEI office. Harvard may need to moderate its policy like Columbia has smartly done. But why punish Harvard this way? Expelling more than 6,000 international students, and the Chinese students is quite a big body of them, to leave Harvard if they fail to find another university, they have to leave the US because their status in the US would no longer be legitimate. I'm glad Columbia has not been punished this way, but I deeply feel gloomy. This is not the liberal America which would allow different voice, even dissents. The White House cannot allow even internal dissents, which make me feel America is no longer the oldie, goldie American which cares internationalism, globalism, institutionalism. So America is, in my view, has identified the right problem, but has not offered the right solution. Probably is generating more problems than the problem it could potentially overcome. So primarily identify three problems, which is no cooperation on international trade and economy and technology, and American first, not a global first. American is one of the global community. So American does not care Canadian security. American want to absorb Canada as its new state, which is totally ridiculous. And America does not care Ukraine and even ask Ukraine to repay the money that the Biden government has provided for free. So such an America which has mistakenly labeled itself as American first, but eventually could make Americans international credit, international greatness, which has been plowed by American people and a non-American like me, to feel greatly, to feel gloomy. This is not the good America. America could be lead to a mistaken direction. So I still admit the problem America has, the current American leader have identified is a real problem, but they probably has offered the wrong solution. Third, last point, I need 1 or 2 minutes. How to handle this? I think despite Americans' realism, if not unilateralism or isolationism, other countries still need to use bilateralism, multilateralism to work with America, not because America has abandoned JCPOA, we should not negotiate with Iran. Not because America has abandoned the WHO, we should not give more support to WHO. Not because America would potentially quit NATO. I'm glad that Senator Rubio and his former colleagues, they made a law to make America not to be able to quit NATO in the future. And everybody in the NATO should not care this international security stabilizing machine. NATO should not be directed in a way to threaten Russia. But NATO as a legitimate collective defense machine deserve its flourishing and survival to make a country like even non-NATO member as Ukraine to feel as long as NATO is there, Ukraine is still secure. So let's work with the mainstream of America, which may not be represented by the current White House leader. Some of this mainstream may return through midterm election or US presidential election 4 years later. Let's not feel this is the end of the world. Let me repeat a famous saying, tomorrow is another day. Thank you.
Very much. Now I'm going to turn to Arancha González. Arancha González is an eminent specialist of international trade. She has been the Prime Minister of Spain, and she is now the Dean of Sciences Po in Paris. So, Arancha.
Thank you very much, Jean-Marie, for this opportunity to engage with all of you. And thank you also to my fellow panelists for a very engaging conversation. Let me start by saying that my starting point is basically the decisions that American citizens made, which I don't question, nor do I lament about. The only thing that I do is I take it as a given. This is how democracy works. And let me tell you also that probably there may be good reasons why they did what they did. But seen from Europe, this is in a way not our problem. We have to focus on the consequences of the election that the American citizens made for Europe. And I would put them into three big categories, three big buckets of issues. And I'll put them in increasing order of concern from us. I'll start, and let me start maybe commenting a little bit on Stuart's characterization of President Trump, that unlike him, I don't see as a unilateralist, classic realist in international affairs. I see more in the category of predatory. It's not enough for the US to win, is that the others have to lose. This is a little bit what we see, and we also see something different from previous occasions, which is that he is ideologically aligned with countries that don't share what have traditionally been US values. But again, on the bucket of problems that this represents for the European Union, let me start with the economy and international trade. It's basically a massive increase in uncertainty, which is not good for the European Union, nor do I think it's good for anybody else around the world, including the US, but I will speak about Europe. Huge uncertainty, weaponization of the international economy, weaponization of international trade, and crashing of the basic principles of functioning of the international trading system. I will probably, having lived in the system for a while, agree that the system needs to be course corrected. I would probably agree that the system needs reform, but I would also, seen from Europe, tell you that for us, big trader relying on open markets and on fair competition, it's better to have a system than not to have any system at all. What we see is really an attack on multilateralism, whether it's multilateralism on trade or on finance or on economic cooperation more broadly, and more broadly, an attack on multilateralism as such, on climate, on peace and security, on the UN itself, which is being defunded as we speak. Second bucket of problems is defense and security. Obviously, seen from Europe, defense and security is a very sensitive issue because we were, and I say were, in a defensive alliance, I stress, with the US in NATO. Thus is the collective security and defense guarantee for the North Atlantic. And what we find ourselves is in a situation where it's not only what we saw during the first Trump administration, that the US is putting more conditions for the participation of the US in this alliance, therefore weakening the deterrence effect that any alliance on the military front has. But what we see now is outright hostility to the members of this alliance, be them Europe, be them Canada. This has a very specific area of sensitivity for Europe called Ukraine, where we have seen President Trump align with President Putin, frankly, offering concessions for a so-called ceasefire, not even a peace agreement, but for a ceasefire, offering concessions on behalf of Ukraine without discussing them with Ukraine, and certainly with Europe not being at the table. This for Europe means effectively working to build its own security and defense capabilities. I say Europe, I don't say European Union, because from a security and defense point of view, the right level is not the European Union, is Europe. It's also with the UK, it's also with Norway, it's also with Turkey, that share the same territorial space with us and are protected by the same mechanism. Third and final, and it's probably the most difficult for us in Europe, is basically the weakening of democracy, not to say the weakening of the very concept of democracy. So before that, it was the functioning of democracy. Right now is questioning democracy as such when we hear the president of the US put himself above the law or above the Constitution, then we know there is a problem. This also has a very specific ramification for Europe, which is the very determined collaboration and support that the Trump administration is providing to anti-European integration forces. You know, in the EU, we've got these two groups that have always coexisted, that have to find a modus vivendi, those that want more European sovereignty and those that want more national sovereignty. This is how Europe is built, and what we are seeing now is the Trump administration clearly running for those in Europe that want more national sovereignty and therefore want to undermine the very European Union. So faced with this hostile US administration, and I say this having worked for over 30 years of my life with the US, this is a very different US administration that I have not seen in the past, and I've seen a few by now. Faced with this, for us in Europe is cool-headed, remain united and walk the talk. It's not easy, but, okay, we've seen this before. We've had moments where we had to face toughness and we had to walk the talk, and, we always end up doing it, especially when we are confronted with an existential crisis like we are faced today. Learning to exercise more power. Power and EU are two different concepts, difficult concepts to marry, but we're learning to exercise a little bit more quote unquote power. And thirdly, Europe will remain on the side of openness and more dialogue and cooperation with other nations around the world. So we will not follow the US path of retreating. Our recipe will be probably to double down in relations with the rest of the world. So back to you, Jean-Marie, and again, many thanks for this opportunity to discuss with you.
Thank you very much, Arancha. So we have heard from China and from Europe, and together they represent a rather formidable economic power. But in terms of the future, Africa is very much the continent of the future. When one looks at projections of population, it will be the biggest continent in a decade, actually. And so I turn to Martin Kimani. Martin Kimani was a very distinguished ambassador of Kenya to the United Nations. Many of you who have worked at the UN know him. He's also played an important role in his own country in the head of the efforts for counterterrorism. And he is now the head of the Africa Center, which is one of the great institutions of New York. So, Martin, you are almost a New Yorker, but your heart is with Africa. And how do you see the African continent in this new equation?
Good morning. Thank you, Jean-Marie. I've really learned a lot on this panel. Stuart, your overview and analysis was very striking in seeing the historical echoes of Trump's policies. Well, when it comes to Africa, I want to, of course, start by just sort of going along with Stuart's analysis, which is that it is clear that sort of that Africa does not figure highly in the Trump administration's priorities, clearly. But this is not a departure. It actually is more a continuity of sort of Africa being a continent that's given attention when it comes to humanitarian crisis, especially, and some political crisis, but largely does not figure as a top U.S. priority. To give some sense of the immediate impact of the Trump administration, however, I do not think any region is as impacted by the decisions to close U.S. aid and to cut funding to the UN as much as Africa. If you look at Kenya, for instance, which I represented in government, USAID was providing possibly just under $700 million a year in various forms of aid to the government and to civil society. That makes up about 2% of Kenya's government budget, which is a very modest sum. But if you remove recurrent expenditure and debt servicing from the Kenyan budget, then the USAID amount actually jumps up to 12% of Kenya's development spending. So 12% cut off at a time of great fiscal stress leads directly to real tough outcomes on very vulnerable people. So clinics have shut down. Individuals with who are dealing with HIV/AIDS are having a harder time getting treatment. And if this is an example of what's going on across Africa, then I'm not surprised that the closing of USAID, no matter the merits, and there are some merits to changing USAID and maybe even closing it, but we should be clear that it has had real life consequences for very vulnerable people, including, I think, a significant number of deaths over the last few months. And I think that's going to continue as long as that gap is not filled. But that does not mean that the governments themselves in Africa should not be doing more, but it's to just be clear about the impact of Trump's decision since he came to office. I think, and I'll come back to why I think there could be an opportunity out of this sort of shock to African development systems. The second big impact has been the attempt to rewrite African history, and especially the history of the anti-apartheid movement, and the signal achievement of a multiracial democracy in South Africa. This is underestimated in terms of its global impact. This is not just a South African impact. If you recall, apartheid was a system of such singular malevolence that it met with the opposition of the world's people. The boycotts of South Africa were not African boycotts, they were global boycotts. And in fact, New York City and the Harlem that we sit in was a very important part of that movement. So when these accusations of a white genocide appeared in sort of the alt-right extreme fringe media, that's not a surprise because there's always all kinds of misinformation and lies and confusion in different parts of the internet. But to have those kinds of views find their way to the Oval Office is unusual. And so what you will all, of course, have read about this and be aware of it. I was very struck when President Ramaphosa sought to get a meeting on May the 21st in the White House. This was something that the South Africans sought. They wanted to reset the relationship. They wanted to address the cutting off of aid flows from the United States to South Africa, and they wanted to put some trade deals on the table. What happened in that Oval Office meeting was Zelensky 2, which was a foreign leader coming and going to these press conferences and finding, surprise, surprise, what they had been thinking then preparing for did not turn out to be that way. And so there was a video of white genocide, which depended on now a widely debunked image of supposedly grave sites of Afrikaner and white South Africans, which in fact was not even a photo from South Africa, right? This act, what surprised me about it as a diplomat or a former diplomat was that the South Africans thought that they could get a public win out of this meeting. They did not seem to understand that President Trump's trumpeting of the white genocide story was really about American domestic politics and racial politics and dog whistle politics, which have a notorious history in the United States. And when you combine them with the attacks across the board on DEI, the very concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion, then you then become aware that the white genocide accusation was really about American racial politics, and that there was going to be no way that President Trump was going to back off the claim in the White House on that press conference, no matter what evidence President Ramaphosa chose to give. It was also really striking that President Ramaphosa felt bound to travel with prominent white South Africans, and that they were given a hearing in the White House. And it was as if this African president required the endorsement of white South Africans to be heard and to be credible in the White House. It was simply, for me, a scandal. It was one of the worst diplomatic events I have seen in my lifetime. And I think its repercussions are going to be felt for many years to come, not least because they have now platformed a much more extreme anti-white South African politics, which now justifies itself and says, do you see, we told you so, right? So there's going to be consequences for that. Let me finish on a more hopeful note. When I was a diplomat for Kenya, one of the more, let me not call it infuriating as much as it was a sort of annoying and in a funny way, were the lectures we used to get from the liberals and the sort of American foreign policy types. You'd sit down and you'd be given a nice lecture, whether it's in the White House, the National Security Council, by somebody pretty young who came into office with one campaign or the other, and they'd tell you what you should do to govern your country better and why you're a big disappointment. And when during Trump won, these voices just kept quiet. They could no longer lecture you with a straight face. So this allowed some respite for diplomats. But quite importantly, Trump's sort of lack of interest in Africa, his very transactional nature feels to many African leaders and governments as just what's real. It feels like this is how it's always been, but now Trump is being explicit about it. So if it's transactional, let's get transactional. And you saw in the Ramaphosa meeting, Ramaphosa saying, I wish I had a jet. I mean, if I had a jet, I would give it to you, right? You saw President Tshisekedi of the DRC trying to buy himself some sort of security deal by trading off rare earth minerals in the eastern part of Congo. So this is the mentality, and the mentality, it feels like if you have a deal for Trump, then bring the deal forth. I think, to close, Jean-Marie, I think this huge shock in the system of the closing of US aid, the shifting of America's political tone, its withdrawal from different parts of the international system, including the funding of the UN, is going to meet with the young Africans' demands for more independent thinking by their governments and better delivery. The stress on the present class of leaders in Africa is going to be enormous. And I expect, negatively, some breakages of systems, but two, I expect some responses where we're going to need to address development without ODA. We're going to need to have better ideas and better governance to overcome this particular challenge. And I think President Trump, in doing what he has done, has offered us an opportunity to be much more independent in the way we approach our own governance and development.
I'm going to turn to Shankar Menon. Shankar Menon has been the National Security Advisor of India. He has been the Foreign Secretary. He has been ambassador to a number of countries, including China. And so I think it's very important to hear you, because India, we are growing the concept of multi-alignment, and it's a rapidly growing country. It has managed to have stable relations with China. It has that. It is engaging a lot with Europe. It hasn't broken with Russia. But it had the recent war, nevertheless, when there was the war with Pakistan. So you are at the center of things in a difficult part of the world. And so what do you make of this new America?
Thank you, Jean-Marie, and thank you very much for having me. We'd rather not be at the center of things, and we'd rather be in a much easier situation. But just to tell you what one Indian thinks of this, I agree with Stuart that actually what we're seeing is a continuation of historical trends in the US, and that it's therefore significant that that in a sense, liberalist, globalist America is gone. Maybe we're dealing with little America in a sense. But in many ways, I find that Trump 2.0 is in some ways very different from Trump 1.0. I mean, we found it easier in India, speaking purely as India, to deal. It wasn't smooth, but it was easier to deal with the first Trump administration. This time, it seems to be a much more organized, radical, and possibly more ideological and therefore possibly even more effective attack on the old American policies that we knew. Prime Minister Modi's approach to this was to reach out to the new administration. He was one of the first visitors to the White House on February 13th, and they issued a joint statement which was very positive and comprehensive, and have since agreed a roadmap on a bilateral trade agreement which they hope to conclude by the fall. But that doesn't make for a smooth or easy relationship. During the recent India-Pakistan crisis, after the 22nd April terrorist attacks, the Trump administration moved almost overnight from indifference, from saying publicly that this is not our business, and they'll take care of it themselves, India and Pakistan, to actually actively promoting a ceasefire, claiming the credit in public for the ceasefire, and equating India and Pakistan, and treating this really as another deal-making and reputation-enhancing opportunity. I think we've just heard how there is also no attempt by this administration to hide the sort of disdain for the global South. And frankly, all the changes in US foreign economic policy, the move away from an open trading system, we've just heard all that, the dismantling of US aid, medical programs, the attack on higher education also, discrimination against foreign students, all these. And I think there's much less hope of concerted international action on the kinds of transnational issues we face today, whether it's developing country debt, which according to the IMF, over 55 countries in the developing world face one form of financial stress or the other and are close to it's really a global crisis. So frankly, what we see makes the US unreliable as an ally and a partner, and results actually in accelerating a drift towards alternatives, whether it's the over 40 countries in the global South who want to join BRICS, an organization which frankly still has to prove its actual utility and ability to create outcomes in the international system. But the mere fact that they look to that alternative, or the drift towards China, whether it's in Europe, whether it's among traditional US allies in Asia, Japan, Korea, in Central Asia, and so on. So from India's point of view, when I look at it, what is the purpose of our foreign policy? Our foreign policy is meant to enable the transformation of India and India's own development. And that is going to be much harder in this new economic climate that US policies under President Trump have created. The US drift towards protectionism, I would still call it a form of isolationism. And I would say xenophobia, and I would dare say some even racism among followers. This is real and it's significant, and it will probably last for a while. It also means that US authority shrinks, and the US is therefore of diminishing utility to its partners. So I think we're going to see many more, well, minilaterals, but plurilateral, other arrangements, issue-based coalitions of the willing and able, with or without or with diminished US participation. And we'll see much less US involvement. My basic point, however, is that there is no going back. Because this is a historic shift, I think there's no going back from where we are. We will, each of us, as Arancha said very clearly, we will clearly try and work with the US administration, but we'll also look with what we can do with our other partners and what we can do ourselves. But I don't see this shift in US policy as being rolled back. There are things that cannot be rolled back, and there are other things which will probably last for a while because they represent something lasting. That doesn't mean that I would write off the US. You know, I'm an old man. I've seen the US written off 5 times in my lifetime. I first went to the US in the early 60s and was there through the mid-60s when the US was tearing itself apart, assassinating a president, civil rights, the Vietnam War, you name it. I mean, the campuses, the only students studying were us foreigners. There was nobody else in the classes. But the US is an amazing place. It has this ability to remake itself and reinvent itself through history, which is rare. I'm less worried about what happens to the US than about what happens to the rest of the world because of the changes that we see. I'll stop there because I can go on and on, but I'd better stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Shankar. So the game is not over, but for the world, the impact may be lasting. Now, Stuart, the speakers, they pushed back a bit on what you said, which was expected, and I think you wanted that. So how do you push back on the pushback?
But let me do a quick bullet point on pretty much each of these, because I thought those were great, decisive comments, and I agree with everything that everybody said, so I don't think there's a lot of disagreement.
Sorry, but I can't hear at all. I don't know if I'm the only one, but the sound is not coming through.
I think that was my technologically inept self. I wanted to thank everybody for their comments. I thought they were all terrific, and I agreed with pretty much everything everybody said. A quick bullet point on each, just to keep the conversation going. Shankar made an excellent point about Trump 2.0 being more active and definitely more dangerous, and Arancha made the same commentary. Partly that's because it's not necessarily just ideologically changed and things like that, which is definitely part of it, but it's because of the mandate that they won in the 2024 election. And they feel the wind in their backs, not just Trump, but this type of conservatism. It makes it seem like Biden looked like the rescue plan in 2020, but he now looks like the outlier for this moment in history. And how we sort of pull ourselves back from this and reform. I also want to agree with Shankar. I'm writing a book called Experimental Power, all about how the United States has reinvented itself through these moments of inevitable decline. And right now, the US is close to 30% of global GDP. It's obviously still the biggest military power in the world. It still has the best prospects in the world, even with all of its current dysfunctions. So we make a mistake of writing them off. Not that any of the panelists today would make that case. New York Times did a great piece over the weekend showing the swing to conservatism in the last 3 elections, and Democrats and neoliberals ignore that stuff at their own peril. We need a better way to push back on this moment, and US is good at that stuff. Jefferson and Hamilton fought this stuff out in the 1790s. The US has constantly fought back against itself on these different moments. Arancha, a quick point on, and I agree with you that Trump is way more predatory, but he still is fitting within the construct of international realism. International realism has a defensive sort of organization, also has an offensive realist mindset or predatory type realism, so he's non-ideological and makes him look like he's aligning with other predatory powers or spheres of influence out there in the world, which I think is true. And that's a big part of the problem. But when you see something like his actions towards Panama or Greenland as predatory, which they are, they're also defensive in the sense that those are parts of the traditional Monroe Doctrine, North America continent stuff. So again, as Shankar mentioned, this does go back in history. There's strong bipartisan support for protection of the Western Hemisphere. So Trump is a little bit of both, Arancha. He's a defensive realist, but he's also very predatory and transactional, obviously, internationally, without an ideology, which makes him dangerous in many ways. Final point, because a lot of people, Martin particularly brought up, and I totally agree with this, the soft power component, USAID. I want to remind everybody, USAID and foreign aid programs in general were invented by the United States. And they were invented by a guy named John F. Kennedy, who created USAID, and he created the Peace Corps. And he said something very interesting after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when it was clear that the United States and the Soviet Union were not going to be able to fight a war that anyone couldn't survive because of nuclear weapons. And John F. Kennedy, playing off Woodrow Wilson, who was a big liberal ideologue and a spreading democracy and all this other stuff, John Kennedy said, it's time to make the world not safe for democracy, safe for diversity. And we need to have, I agree, I believe there's 3 reforms that are needed, like I mentioned before. Trade organization has to become more realistic. We can't have certain free riders slipstreaming past deleting powers and then changing the entire world order like some powers in the world want to do. We have to reform the system of alliances. Allies have to pay more. We're going to probably have a NATO-type alliance system in East Asia, which is being developed right now. We can't have NATO fighting in East Asia. Okay, that plays right into China's hands, that NATO and the Western liberals just want to take over the whole world. We need regional alliances that make sense in regional contexts. And the third most important point is the 1990s was not only famous for the US having these populist movements, it was famous for the US cutting off foreign aid, because it was the end of the Cold War, it's time for the peace dividend, and the US cut off foreign aid, and what happened? 9/11 happened. And I can make a direct case from the neglect of the peripheral so-called parts of the world and the discontent that exists in parts of the world that are not Western and were ignored by Western neoliberal institutions, and 9/11. That's why after 9/11, George W. Bush and Republicans in Congress, along with Democrats, did AIDS in Africa. They promoted a Millennium Challenge account and a whole bunch of ways to reform foreign assistance. So that's the most important part of the reforms, in my opinion. But we have to listen to John Kennedy. It has to be non-ideological as much as possible. Allow the world to be safe for diversity, but help the world develop at the same time. And then we might not agree on all ideologies, Arancha, but we can disagree congenially and get along and make deals that are not just transactional and destructive, but in ways that benefit regions and benefit countries. So that's my final point. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Stuart. I'm going to ask Arancha a question, because I know she's on a tight schedule and may have to leave before the end of our panel. So Europe is a bit squeezed between the United States, the new United States, and China. I mean, with China, there was a number of issues before Trump between Europe and China. So how do you see the Europeans navigating that situation? Do you see them finding more common ground with China? How should they position themselves? How is it going to work?
First, I would say that just like others have said, I don't think the EU should give up on the US. But I think, as the saying goes, once bitten, twice shy. So we also have to make sure not to have an over-reliance on the US, especially on the security and defense front, that weakens the ability of the EU to take decisions when the US is explicitly against that. So I'm not advocating cutting the relations with the US, but I'm basically advocating being a bit more careful, much more careful about how we engage with the US. By the same token, I don't advocate all of a sudden building an alliance with China, nor do I think the European Union can live ignoring China. I think what the European Union needs is a functional relationship with China. For now, the EU has this very diplomatic construct called China is a partner, a competitor, and a rival, which says it all and says nothing. Because at the end of the day, it depends on how much of each one of these categories in order to understand what kind of policy the European Union has vis-a-vis China. I'm advocating for a functional relationship with China. And functional means that we have a more explicit view of what our engagement should be with China. It should be very clear that there are things on which we fundamentally disagree with China. We fundamentally disagree on notions like human rights. We have a disagreement over how to deal with Russia, and this is an important one, and getting this right will matter a lot for setting this functional relationship between Europe and China. But we have many areas where we see eye to eye. We both are working to reduce CO2 emissions. We both take climate change seriously. We both consider that it's an existential threat to us, and therefore there is a bigger space and scope to work on that, to more broadly on sustainability issues, on which China and the EU see it probably in the same way. We have a bigger space to work on the economy and on international trade. Today, when the US market is closed essentially for China, the European market remains essentially open to China. So a functional relationship for me could mean Europe keeping its market open to China, China accepting to play by fair trade rules, both accepting not to weaponize international trade, and both of them probably having a better understanding about investment from each other to each other that would benefit both sides. So there is a space, in my view, to craft a functional relationship with China when China represents 32% of emissions, 13% of international trade, 14% of GDP in the world. We cannot ignore China, nor should we engage in this idea that we decouple from China, because we all know that this is not what we will do. So we'd rather be honest about what we say so that we be honest about what we do. Back to you, Jean-Marie.
I'd like to open the floor to the room, but I have one last question maybe for Shen Dingli, and then we'll open to the room, and you tell me who you want to direct the question to. The question I have for you, Professor Shen Dingli, is in the decades, the United States has sometimes violated international law. Certainly the war in Iraq was a violation of international law. War in Kosovo, possibly too. But I'll be an advocate of the United States by saying that in many occasions, the United States has been a provider of public goods, of some kind of international order. And when one looks at China, there's a sense that China is very cautious, let's say, in sticking its neck out, if I may say. It doesn't, in some ways, one can celebrate that because it doesn't interfere in the lives of other countries as much as the United States has, for sure. But at the same time, that means that the engagement, the positive engagement of China in helping shore up an international order, it's not self-evident. China certainly has a very active trade policy. Will it have a political, so to speak, foreign policy? Over to you.
Could you clarify your question?
Okay. No, what I mean is that China is China willing to sort of underwrite an international order that may be different from the international order that was underwritten by the United States, but is it ready to play a more active, a more visible role in sort of managing international affairs? We see the Middle East, for instance, where, I mean, the US interventions in the past have been far from successful, but you could say the United States were engaged. China doesn't, when China played a role in bringing Iran and Saudi Arabia closer, but there are not that many instances of China playing an active international diplomatic role.
Probably different people have different answer. Chinese government claim that China respect international law. But China is often questioned, especially recently, why China is not interested in a world order that is based on rule of law. So China is challenged. Why China does not accept UNCLOS ruling on South China Sea? Why China does not implement China's WTO accession paper, even by today? Why China does not fully implement the 2020 first phase agreement between China and the US on economic and trade? But China has more questions to US. Why China, US has not abided by UN decision on the question of Afghanistan, etc. In my personal view, my sense is that China is a country which cares realism. When international law protects China's interest, China would say China abide by international law. But increasingly, international law may not protect the China interest, especially on South China Sea. So China would have some a la carte behavior. China uses national law. For instance, it's China's national law on territorial water and adjacent water, and China's national law on EEZ and continental shelf as a base. Why China could not accept permanent court of arbitration's ruling, which is based on UNCLOS. So China used a mixed two-wheel, mostly accepting international law. Sometimes China has its own unilateralism. As long as international law does not fit China's interest, China would use other arguments. This is my personal observation. I'm not a government official. My government may be unhappy if you let this to be uploaded in your website. I can have some trouble, but I don't care. I retired. This is my true observation. That explains China's behavior. I cannot use one uniform theory to explain China's behavior. And I think this is easier because China has so much a complex international environment. Not all law good for China's old interest may be good for China's current interest. But as a professor, I am more inclined as certain kind of idealism. Even though we may hurt ourselves by observing international law for some issue, we would gain fundamentally and eternally more get international respect that China is a rule-based observer of the current international system, which is co-made by US and China. US and China made the United Nations together and made the GATT together. Of course, China later joined the WTO, which is a successor organization of GATT. But GATT, China, US made together. So let's not say international system is a US system. It's basically US promoting some original idea which has gathered the majority support of the major stakeholder at various times. And China could be a major stakeholder. So let's say it's our system. We should not deviate from it. We can gain more by observing it. That's my view. I'm not sure if someday I'm an official, I would deviate from what I'm saying now. But I hope we would fundamentally gain from what we used to believe. It's not in our interest because it's good. It's our belief. It's religion. It's a Bible. That's my current view, a professor's view.
Thank you for your view, Professor. I think it's a very important statement that you made. And what I gather from our exchange is that in a way, one big risk for the world, and we discussed it before the session started, is that the lack of consideration for the rule of law that we see in the present US administration, it can sort of trickle down in the world. And that's the danger. It's a multiplication of unilateral actions where force and money matter more than the rule of law. That's a great concern. But we have a few minutes left for questions. And so I see two hands there immediately.
Thank you.
Chris, identify yourself and
Thank you. My name is Bastian. I work with the United Nations. Thanks so much to all the panelists. Professor Gottlieb, I struggle with the notion that the current administration has no ideology. I mean, maybe that's true for the person to an extent, Trump, who seems to be a bit of an avatar that different people project their ideology on, but underpinning it, in my view, is very strong ideological undercurrents. Otherwise, why would you see a CPAC version of MAGA-ism rolled out across Europe, for example? Why would you see the hosting of these type of engagements, a brand being exported? Or as Ambassador Kimani, I think you put it really well, why engage in these dog whistle politics if not for ideological purposes? So I'd love to see that a bit more unpacked.
Okay, let's collect a few questions. So ideology in the Trump administration, yes.
Thank you. Oliver Grünbacher from the Austrian Permanent Mission to the UN. I work on human rights. Thank you to the panelists for this really interesting discussion. I have actually one question and one thing I wanted to add to Bastian's question. I agree. I had the feeling that it's almost an export of American culture wars, if you want to say that, to a global stage. So how do you feel about this statement? Because I think you can also see it play out, for example, when foreign leaders visit Trump in the Oval Office. President Ramaphosa clearly, for example, was put into a certain box already before by, I would say, the MAGA Republicans, and this is the position where he had to come from. There was no way out for him, I think. And my actual question was, do you think that there is a sort of grand plan that the Trump administration has for the UN? Because right now, I mean, they're honestly, for example, okay, the Security Council is different, but if you look at the ECOSOC or the General Assembly, the American colleagues calling for votes on resolutions that they're bound to lose with giving creative explanations afterwards. Is this a situation where you would see them for the rest of Trump's term, or is there at some point an effort to maybe remake the UN, or maybe even an assault, a full-on assault at the UN? And what would be a good, and for example, I'm thinking about the moment when US contributions at the UN are not paid, and then you have an issue with, for example, voting rights and so on. So, but I would be interested to hear your opinions on that. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay. You go.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, me?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Judge Commander. Thank you to all the panelists. I think we have had quite a very varied perspective on the global landscape, particularly with the new, in quotes, the new United States. My question specifically is for Mr. Kimani. I sense, I think from several of the panelists talk about maybe the shock that such a change, of course, in the system, but specifically you talked about, the shock that this new US policy, of course, to African development in that regard. So my question is, I think in your conclusion, you said it does have a ripple effect, because I agree with you, because I think I'm hoping that this will inspire African leaders to do better and serve better. So in your experience, now I know now you're out of diplomacy and maybe out of government specifically. So what maybe 3 points that you can offer, to really construct this way forward? Because in our initial introduction, I said there is an awakening, that other countries are pushing back against the fragmentation of the international legal order. So what 3 things can you maybe say to African leaders, but also by extension, African citizens or advocates championing African policies, to use this opportunity to say, okay, this is our time to also fix our system, do better and do right by our societies? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the panelists. I'm Shen Dingli from China. I have a particular question to Professor Gottlieb and Kimani, President Kimani. And my question is, this is not the first time that Donald Trump came into power. So I'm wondering, and also you have introduced how the previous US administrations retrenched from multilateral institutions. So I'm wondering, how do you see the key differences between him and his first administration, and also the attitudes towards multilateralism?
Okay, thank you very much. That was a very insightful take on US politics, or rather US international relations. Sorry, I'm Mateko Litzia from South Africa. And I really do want to agree with what most of the speakers have said. And I think to you, Stuart, one thing that you have said, which is lamented in our own thinking, is that American foreign policy really hasn't changed. And I think to your point, it's just re-emphasizing that, and it's just the varying degrees that change with the various administrations that come in. And I think just from a South African perspective, we thought the performance by President Ramaphosa was actually brilliant at the Oval Office. It's not that we were taken by surprise by what the showdown was going to be. Maybe we didn't know all the elements of what was going to take place in the Oval Room, but certainly who was presented in that room is the face of what South Africa and realistically what South Africa is. The three golfers that were invited to the Oval House were not invited by President Ramaphosa; they were invited by the President of the United States. For what reason? It may have benefited him from hearing from white South Africans that there actually is no genocide in South Africa. And then you take it to other prominent businessmen. It's no secret, South Africa's economy is still run by the minority. And it was good, it was important that they were also there to debunk the notion that there is a genocide that is taking place there. So I think from public opinion, what has really worked for South Africa's favor is actually the lies that were peddled, that were internationally then seen to be a lie. And I don't think that was embarrassing to the country. On the contrary, it was reinforcing the fact that there was a lie about white genocide. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
We are running over time, so I'm going to ask Stuart and Martin Kimani to answer the question that was specifically directed to them, and Shen Dingli and Shankar Menon to share with us their final thoughts on the discussion.
A couple of questions directed at me, some related. This notion of the United Nations, let me go to that one first, which connects also to kind of bigger ideology on the UN, and it connects to the multilateralism question also. You have to remember, before 9/11, George W. Bush was doing similar things with international institutions, including cutting off funding for the UN. He took the United States out of the ABM Treaty, took the US out of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the Global Climate Change Treaty, the International Criminal Court Treaty, he actually unsigned So once again, we're seeing a continuity of this part of America that goes back to the 1790s, if I had more time. I'm sorry, the 1790s. One thing about the UN, which is interesting, and Marco Rubio, he's actually an acolyte of John F. Kennedy. He is a believer in soft power and global politics until he became Secretary of State. And I think Trump trusts him, and he still has an influence there. By the way, we saw similar stuff about South Africa and the United States and racism and very nasty stuff out of the United States during the Reagan administration, when he was one of the last Western powers still supporting South Africa due to anti-communism. So unfortunately, it's not the first time we've seen this type of America underbelly coming to the forefront. Trump comes with a lot of wreckage and a lot of dangerous stuff. The question is, do we survive it, build from it, and like America has in the past, as some of the other panelists said, and build something better on some of the more dark undercurrents and underbellies that do exist? We can't, and they're in Europe too, by the way. We can't pretend that they don't exist. Final point on ideology. It's a great question. Yes, of course, there's an ideology. And actually, Trump described himself as the avatar of Western civilization. But if you read the Michael Kimmage article in Foreign Affairs, there's a foundation of this stuff, which is more of a nationalist democratic. It's a Sam Huntington Clash of Civilizations view of Western liberalism. And what's unique and interesting, and Arancha's not here anymore, but what's unique and interesting about Trump, which would make Huntington go kind of crazy, is that Trump is also going after other Western liberal countries like in Europe and Western Europe. So he is a unique figure in this long history of America, but he is absolutely connected by democratic elections, even to the point where he, insists they're overthrown. He still looks at democracy as a cornerstone, as all the populists in Europe do. And you're looking at the fight with Le Pen in France over whether she could run. I mean, these are fights over democracy, and democracy was founded by Western liberalism. And so it's a much more conservative, nationalist, populist version of democracy. The danger is, do these populists respect democracy when they get into power? And that's always been the threat of authoritarian impulses. And the founding fathers in this country wrestled with this stuff in the Constitutional Convention and tried to build checks and balances, as imperfect as they are. I think they're going to hold. We can all talk about it next 5 years, 10 years. If I'm wrong, we can have a chat about it. I think that this will flush out. This is an extreme moment. It's a pendulum swing, and the U.S. typically rebalances. The United States pulled out of the League of Nations, or didn't join the League of Nations that it invented in 1918 and 1919. It invented this Western liberal institutionalism, and then what did it do? It pulled out of it. So the U.S. does these things that look extremely reckless, extremely self-centered, of course it is, and yet it survives because it's a dominant power. It's still nearly 30% of global GDP, and it has to be taken seriously. And other democracies have similar themes, and I'm going to turn it over back to Jean-Marie, but thank you for those questions. I thought they were excellent.
Yeah, I know we don't have much time, and I'm happy to answer after this. I'll hang around a bit. To just address the questions that have come to me, Trump one had what the people who call themselves the adults in the room, which are basically people from past administrations who sort of were, quote unquote, holding Trump back. They were frustrating his instincts and his political, what he saw as what he wanted to do. Trump 2 doesn't have those people. Trump 2 is more prepared and is more willing to break the China in the room in pursuit of its goals. And for that reason, Trump 2 is a lot more formidable. When it comes to the UN, I think the UN is in shock, and I've been following closely, as I'm sure Jean-Marie has, the conversation going on from what we hear on the 38th floor and other parts of the UN. And so far, I haven't seen a real vision emerge of a UN that is new and more vibrant. One of the things that I think the Trump administration has sort of hinted at, or at least mentioned, is coming back to the peace and security mandate of the United Nations and doing more with that. I actually, one of my proposals, which I sent around to some people in the UN, was that it seems to me that a lot of peace mediation today is done by rich countries that promise some economic investments as a dividend of the peace that they want you to, the ceasefire they want you to sign. And the UN now has the tools to do that if it refocuses parts of itself to accompany peace mediation. So for instance, UNDP and the UN development system can do a lot more to design infrastructure and cross-border packages between countries that are having tensions or even conflicts with one another. It's just to reimagine and revitalize the UN in terms of its peace and security mandate. So those people who are here in the UN, I think there's going to be more humanitarian focus, as has been the trend, but also perhaps there should be a greater focus on peace and security, where the UN still has a lot that it could do if the leadership imagines things in a more bold fashion. Lastly, I do think Ramaphosa was brilliant in the White House, but the problem with diplomacy is that the first question is not how to perform brilliantly, it's whether you should even perform. One of the things that I learned as a diplomat was I envied quiet diplomats because I was a noisy one. And I realized there were people who actually use their silence and their withdrawal of their presence as a form of engagement. And if I was advising the Kenyan president today and said, should I go for the Trump Africa Summit in September? I'd say, no, take a sick day off and watch as the others are led to the slaughter. Don't go unless you have a deal. If you don't have a deal, just fade away in the background. Go to China, cut some trade and investment deals.
Thank you. Let me now turn to Shankar Menon, and we'll conclude with Shen Dingli.
Thank you. I'll make just two quick points to conclude. There was a question about, is it likely that the UN will be remade? Frankly, I'm not sure that the conditions exist even for the kind of reform of the existing international system that Stuart was talking about. And, and this is because fundamentally world orders are the product of a huge imbalance in power. And without that kind of imbalance, 13th century, the Mongols, Europe, Western Europe in late 19th, early 20th century, the US since World War II. But world orders are an exception, actually, in history. They're an anomaly. They haven't existed for most of the time. Today, if you look at the world, China and the US together account for less than 50% of world GDP and less than 50% of world military power. At the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union and its allies, Warsaw Pact and NATO on their part, accounted for over 80% of world GDP and military power. And therefore, you could actually speak of an international system which was bipolar. There was a world order in functioning. Today, you don't have that. Today, all the great powers are revisionist. Today, you have a much flatter distribution of power. And you have a fragmentation. And as you heard, politically, we have each country really looking out for itself. So for me, it's unlikely that we'll see the international order being another world order. I used to call this this situation as being a world between orders, but I now think it's a world adrift, and we've gone back to the historical norm. And therefore, for me, remaking the UN and so on is unlikely. There'll be tinkering on the margins, certainly, and the UN will make itself useful. But there is a fundamental problem. An organization composed of member states cannot be effective when those member states are quarreling with each other. And that's what we face today. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Shen Dingli.
Last few words. When Trump launched a tariff war on April 2nd, he has to have a ceasefire in a week by April the 9th, because he has hurt American dollar, T-bill, and stock market. So naturally, America has some internal system which would check and balance any leaders imprudent, to say at least, rude behavior. So like Ambassador Menon just said at the beginning, he has first visited America in 1960. I came later as 1989. So he saw more Americans than I have seen. But to my observation, Americans' political direction moves like a pendulum from one side to another side, from overstressing something to overstressing the counter things. In 2 years, midterm election would come. So for Trump first edition, Democrats initially command both chambers, but for the midterm election, Democrats return. Nancy Pelosi chaired the Democrats' control over the U.S. House. Who knows what would happen after 2 years? Trump may continue to have his free will move in 1 year. Then he could be punished by his imprudent, erroneous action. So I think over time, he would be more check and balanced by his own cabinet, by his own people. And as a world community, European, Chinese, Russian, Indian, all people in the world would respect an America that respects the world, not an America that is selfish. So I expect in 2 years, in 4 years, America would have a periodical check and balance. So I still have faith in American internal mistake correcting mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists. They tell us two things, that national institutions matter and international institutions matter too. Thank you.